"My family has always been perfect," my father said into the microphone, smiling out at the thousands of guests seated across the stadium. "And tonight, we celebrate the daughter who made us proud." The giant screens around the field magnified his face as the crowd applauded. My sister stood beside her new husband on the illuminated wedding stage, glowing in a white dress that looked like it belonged in a royal ceremony. The entire stadium had been transformed into a spectacle of wealth and perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung from towering metal structures above the grass. Cameras floated through the air, capturing every angle, and a live orchestra played softly beneath the sound of my father's voice. To anyone watching, this looked like the celebration of a flawless American family. Then my father's smile changed. He lifted his glass again and continued speaking, but this time his voice carried a colder edge. "I only have one daughter," he said slowly, turning toward the bride. "The one standing on this stage tonight." The applause faded into confused murmurs. My father glanced toward the far rows of seats where I was standing among the guests. "The other one," he added calmly, "was just a mistake we were forced to live with." A ripple of whispers spread across the stadium almost instantly. People turned their heads, trying to locate the person he was talking about. My mother, seated near the stage beside several influential guests, laughed softly and leaned toward the microphone that had been placed near the family table. "We should have given her away a long time ago," she said lightly, as if she were making an amusing remark at a dinner party. Laughter erupted from a few people near the stage who assumed it was part of some awkward joke. But most of the stadium fell into stunned silence. Thousands of eyes began searching through the crowd, trying to find the daughter who had just been erased from her own family. I stood in the last section of seats near the exit tunnel, watching the scene unfold on the enormous screens above the field. For a moment, the cameras even found me, projecting my face across the stadium before the operators quickly shifted away, unsure whether they were supposed to show the daughter my father had just disowned. I could hear the whispers around me now, people asking questions, people staring, people pretending not to stare. But I didn't move. My fingers tightened around the small leather bag hanging from my shoulder. Inside it were only 3 things: a faded photograph of my grandfather Henry smiling beside a fishing boat decades ago, a small folded piece of paper containing the last sentence he ever wrote to me, and a black USB drive that held the quiet record of everything my family had spent years hiding. The stadium lights glowed brighter as the wedding ceremony resumed. The orchestra continued playing as if nothing unusual had happened. My father raised his glass again and began speaking about loyalty, tradition, and family pride, while the guests tried to convince themselves the strange moment they had just witnessed was some kind of misunderstanding. I finally turned toward the exit. No one tried to stop me. A few people stepped aside politely, unsure whether to apologize or pretend they hadn't seen anything. Their confusion almost made me smile. They were watching the public collapse of a family they had spent years admiring, and they didn't even realize the real story hadn't begun yet. Outside the stadium, the air felt colder. I walked across the quiet parking lot toward my car while the music from the wedding echoed faintly behind me. The enormous building glowed like a monument to everything my family wanted the world to believe about them: wealth, respect, power. But the truth about the Halston family had never existed inside that stadium. It existed in the memories I carried from childhood. I remembered sitting in empty school auditoriums waiting for my parents to attend performances they had promised to watch. I remembered the polite smiles they used whenever reporters asked about their beautiful daughters. Isabella was always the perfect one, the heir, the pride of the family. I was the quiet shadow who asked too many questions about things that didn't make sense. Only one person in the family ever treated me differently. My grandfather Henry used to say something whenever he caught me staring at the world with that suspicious look in my eyes. "Never beg for love from people who don't know how to give it," he once told me. I unlocked my car and sat quietly for a moment before starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, the stadium lights still glowed against the night sky, celebrating the wedding of the daughter my father was proud to claim. I reached into my bag and wrapped my fingers around the USB drive. The humiliation inside that stadium hadn't surprised me. It had simply confirmed something I had known for years. My family had just declared me a mistake in front of 1,000 people. Now it was time for the world to see what kind of family they really were. The highway lights stretched across the windshield as I drove away from the stadium, and for the first time since my father lifted the microphone, the noise of the crowd finally disappeared. The silence inside the car felt strange after the spectacle I had just left behind. Thousands of people were still celebrating my sister's perfect wedding inside that enormous stadium, applauding the daughter my father proudly claimed while pretending the other one had never existed. I kept my eyes on the road, but the giant screens replaying his words were still burned into my memory. I only have one daughter. It had taken him less than 10 seconds to erase me in front of 1,000 guests. I didn't cry. That surprised even me. Instead, a strange calm settled over me as the city skyline appeared in the distance. My father believed that moment had ended the story. In his mind, humiliation was power. Public rejection meant control. But what he didn't understand was that I had stopped expecting love from my family years ago. The wedding speech didn't break me. It simply confirmed something I had already known. I parked outside my apartment building nearly 30 minutes later. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few lights glowing behind apartment windows where people were finishing dinner or watching late-evening television. Ordinary lives continuing peacefully while the Halston family reputation was quietly beginning to fracture somewhere across the city. Inside my apartment, the silence felt different from the heavy quiet inside the car. This space belonged only to me. No cameras, no guests, no carefully rehearsed family image, just a small living room, a desk beside the window, and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I set my bag on the desk and slowly opened it. 3 items rested inside. The first was a faded photograph of my grandfather Henry standing beside a fishing boat on a quiet lake many years ago. The second was a folded piece of paper he had written shortly before he died. The third was a small black USB drive. I picked up the photograph first. Grandfather Henry had been the only person in my family who ever noticed when I felt invisible. While my parents attended charity galas and business dinners with Isabella proudly at their side, he was the one who stayed behind with me on quiet weekends at his lake house. He never pretended our family was perfect. Instead, he watched everything carefully, the way people do when they already suspect the truth hiding beneath polite conversations. One afternoon when I was 17, he caught me staring across the lake while my parents argued inside the house about one of my father's business trips. "You ask too many questions," he said gently. "I just want to understand things," I answered. He smiled in a sad way that I didn't understand until years later. "Then remember this," he told me. "Never beg for love from people who don't know how to give it." I unfolded the small piece of paper beside the photograph. The sentence he wrote to me before he died was the same one I had memorized years ago. "Truth doesn't destroy families. Secrets do." I placed the photograph back on the desk and finally picked up the USB drive. For a moment, I simply held it between my fingers, feeling the small weight of something that had taken years to assemble. The first clue appeared when I was 21. I had been working temporarily in one of my father's office buildings during my final year of college, helping sort shipping documentation for a corporate logistics division. The work itself was boring, mostly verifying cargo reports and updating digital records. But one afternoon, a shipment manifest crossed my desk that didn't match the description listed in the company's public database. At first, I assumed it was a simple error, but curiosity has a way of opening doors people would rather keep closed. The shipment had originated from a port known primarily for military equipment exports, yet it was registered under commercial machinery parts. The routing codes also bypassed several standard customs checkpoints normally required for international cargo. One mistake might have been accidental, but a pattern of mistakes usually means something else. That single document became the beginning of a quiet investigation I never intended to start. Over the following years, I noticed more irregularities inside my father's company records. Payments moving through shell corporations registered overseas, shipment schedules that changed suddenly after internal approval emails were sent late at night. Conversations between executives that sounded careful in ways normal business discussions rarely are. I never confronted my father about it. Instead, I began collecting copies, carefully, patiently. The USB drive contained recordings, financial transfers, and shipment reports that slowly revealed the shape of a hidden network operating behind Halston Strategic Transport's respectable public image. My father believed the Halston reputation made him untouchable, but secrets don't stay hidden forever. My phone vibrated softly on the desk beside the laptop. The name on the screen made me pause. Brett. He was one of the few people who knew I had been quietly watching my father's business operations for years. We met during a financial compliance seminar when he casually mentioned how often transport companies were used to disguise illegal shipments. I answered the call. "You saw the wedding speech?" he asked immediately. "Yes." There was a short pause before he spoke again. "Alice, if your father just publicly disowned you in front of that many people," Brett said carefully, "then you're not obligated to protect him anymore." I looked down at the USB drive in my hand. For years, I had carried the truth quietly, unsure when the right moment would come. Now my father had created that moment himself. "Yes," I said quietly, "you're right." And for the first time since leaving the stadium, I realized the story my family had spent decades controlling was finally about to change. The road away from the stadium was almost empty when I finally drove out of the parking lot, but the noise from the wedding still echoed faintly behind me, like a celebration happening in another world. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel while the enormous building slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. Thousands of guests were still inside, applauding the perfect daughter my father had proudly claimed. No one inside that stadium knew that the daughter he had publicly erased had spent years preparing for this exact moment. I had imagined many different ways the confrontation with my family might happen someday. I thought it might occur quietly at a dinner table or during one of my father's controlled charity events where reputation mattered more than honesty. But I had never expected him to choose a stadium filled with 1,000 people as the place where he would declare that I was nothing more than a mistake. For a moment, as the highway lights stretched across the windshield, I almost laughed at the irony. My father had spent his entire life controlling every detail of the Halston family image, yet the moment he decided to erase me in public was the same moment he lost control of the truth. When I reached my apartment building, the city had already settled into the quiet rhythm of late evening. A few lights glowed in neighboring windows as people finished dinner or watched television before going to bed. Ordinary lives continuing without any awareness that the Halston family reputation had just begun to fracture. I parked the car and sat still for a few seconds before stepping out. The night air carried the faint scent of rain and asphalt, a calm contrast to the spectacle I had just left behind. Inside my apartment, the silence felt almost peaceful. There were no cameras, no guests, no carefully staged smiles. Just a small living room, a desk near the window, and a kitchen that looked exactly the way I had left it earlier that morning. I placed my bag on the table and slowly pulled out the photograph of my grandfather Henry. The edges were worn from years of being carried in different purses and boxes, but his smile in the picture had never faded. Grandfather Henry had always been the one person in my family who noticed things other people ignored. When I was a child, he used to sit with me on the back porch of his old lake house while the rest of the family attended social events that never included me. He once told me something that stayed in my mind long after he was gone. "Families like ours build beautiful stories for the world," he said while watching the water ripple across the lake. "But stories are fragile things. One honest question can destroy them." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. I only knew that whenever I asked questions about my father's business or my mother's constant travel, the adults in the room would suddenly change the subject. My sister Isabella never seemed curious about those things. She accepted the explanations our parents gave her because the explanations always placed her at the center of the family's pride. By the time I turned 21, I finally began to understand why my questions made people uncomfortable. It started with a simple document I wasn't supposed to see. I had been working temporarily in one of my father's office buildings during college when a shipment report crossed my desk by accident. The numbers on the page didn't match the type of cargo the company claimed to transport. At first, I assumed it was just a clerical mistake, but the deeper I looked, the stranger the patterns became. That single document became the first thread in a long chain of discoveries. Hidden shell companies registered in distant countries. Payments routed through financial institutions that specialized in anonymous transactions. Shipment routes that passed through ports known for military equipment, transfers rather than commercial cargo. Each discovery felt like stepping deeper into a reality my father had spent decades hiding behind polished business speeches. I didn't confront anyone about it. Not then. Grandfather Henry's words echoed in my mind every time I uncovered something new. Stories were fragile, he had said, but the Halston story had been built carefully, with layers of wealth, influence, and reputation protecting it from scrutiny. So instead of confronting my family, I started collecting pieces of the truth. Quietly, patiently. I walked over to the desk near the window and plugged the black USB drive into my laptop. A series of encrypted folders appeared on the screen, each one containing years of recordings, financial files, and transaction logs that I had slowly gathered while pretending to live an ordinary life outside the Halston spotlight. There were voice recordings of my father discussing shipment schedules that never appeared in public company reports. There were financial documents linking my mother to private accounts used to pay people whose names never appeared in official records. And there were messages between executives who assumed no one outside their circle would ever see the conversations. For years, I had simply watched and documented, not because I enjoyed uncovering the secrets of my own family, but because every piece of evidence confirmed something I had sensed since childhood. The Halston Empire had never been built on integrity. It had been built on silence. A message notification suddenly appeared on my phone lying beside the laptop. The name on the screen made me pause for a moment. Brett. He was one of the few people who knew that the version of my family presented to the public wasn't real. We had met years earlier during a financial compliance seminar when he casually mentioned how often large corporations used transport companies to disguise illegal shipments. At the time, I had asked a few careful questions. That conversation had eventually turned into a quiet partnership built on curiosity and caution. I answered the call and placed the phone against my ear. "You saw the wedding broadcast?" Brett asked immediately. I let out a slow breath. "It's probably trending online by now." There was a short pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again. "Alice, if your father really said what I think he said in front of that many people, then everything changes." I looked back at the laptop screen filled with years of evidence. "Yes," I said quietly. "Everything just changed." Brett arrived the next morning just after sunrise, carrying 2 coffees and the cautious expression of someone who already suspected the day would change more than one life. I opened the door before he even knocked because I had been standing near the window watching his car pull into the parking lot. The night after the wedding had passed slowly, not because I felt uncertain about what needed to happen, but because the reality of the moment had finally caught up with me. For years, the evidence on that USB drive had been a silent record of things no one in my family believed I would ever dare reveal. Now the decision about what to do with it was no longer theoretical. Brett stepped inside and placed one of the coffees on the kitchen counter. "I saw the clips online this morning," he said carefully. "Your father's speech is everywhere. News channels are calling it a family dispute at a high-profile wedding." He paused for a moment, studying my face. "But they don't know the real story yet." "They will," I replied. He nodded slowly and walked toward the desk where my laptop still displayed the encrypted folders. Brett had spent years working in financial compliance, investigating irregular corporate transfers that often led to complex legal cases. The first time I showed him a small portion of the documents connected to my father's company, he reacted with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood the scale of what he was looking at. "This isn't just questionable accounting," he said that day years ago. "If these records are accurate, someone is moving restricted military equipment through commercial channels." Now he leaned over the desk again, opening several of the folders with the calm focus of someone reviewing evidence rather than gossip. Shipment logs appeared on the screen, followed by transaction histories connecting Halston Strategic Transport to shell companies registered in multiple countries. Brett moved through the files slowly, occasionally asking short questions about dates or locations while I explained where each document had come from. After nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back in the chair and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Alice, this is bigger than I thought," he said. "If investigators ever see this entire archive, your father's company won't just face reputation problems. There could be criminal charges." I wasn't surprised by his conclusion. For years, I had slowly assembled the evidence piece by piece until the pattern became impossible to ignore. My father's logistics empire had always looked legitimate from the outside, but hidden inside the shipping schedules and financial transfers were movements that had nothing to do with commercial cargo. "Do you remember the first file I showed you?" I asked. Brett nodded. "The shipment report from Prague." "Exactly," I said. "That document wasn't even important by itself. It was just the first clue that something didn't match the official records. Every discovery after that came from asking why the numbers kept changing." Brett opened another folder and studied one of the audio files. "You recorded these yourself?" "Some of them," I answered. "Others came from internal communication systems inside the company. Executives talk differently when they believe no one outside their circle is listening." He remained silent for several seconds, clearly considering the implications of everything in front of him. Finally, he closed the laptop halfway and looked directly at me. "You understand what happens once this becomes public," he said. "Your father's influence will disappear quickly. Business partners will walk away, investigators will move in, and your family will know exactly who exposed the truth." I met his gaze without hesitation. "They already decided who I was to them," I said quietly. "Last night just made it official." Brett exhaled slowly, accepting that my decision had already been made long before the wedding. "Then we need a plan," he said. He walked over to the kitchen counter and opened his laptop beside mine. Within minutes, he began outlining a strategy on the screen. Instead of releasing the information directly to the media, he suggested a more controlled approach. "If the evidence appears suddenly online, your father's lawyers will call it manipulation," Brett explained. "But if investigators receive the documentation first, the truth will come out through official channels. That's harder for anyone to deny." I nodded, understanding the logic immediately. My goal had never been public revenge or dramatic exposure. What mattered was making sure the truth reached people who could verify it legally. Brett continued working while I watched the city waking outside the window. Morning traffic began moving along the streets below, ordinary lives starting another routine day. "You know," Brett said after a moment, "your father probably believes the wedding speech ended the problem." I almost smiled at that. "He thinks he erased me," I replied quietly. Brett glanced up from his laptop. "But what he actually did," he said, "was give you the perfect reason to stop protecting him." For the first time since leaving the stadium, I felt something close to calm certainty. The Halston story had survived for decades because everyone inside it agreed to stay silent. Now the silence was over. 2 nights after the wedding, my apartment looked calmer than I felt. The table in the center of the room was set carefully with 4 plates, simple glasses, and a pair of candles that cast warm light across the wooden surface. Anyone walking into the room would assume it was an ordinary dinner between family members trying to resolve an uncomfortable situation. That illusion was intentional. My parents had spent their entire lives controlling how things appeared to the outside world, and tonight I intended to let them believe the same rules still applied. Brett arrived an hour before my family. He moved quietly through the apartment, checking the small recording devices we had placed near the living room shelves and along the kitchen counter. None of them were obvious, but together they would capture every word spoken at the table. His laptop remained open in the bedroom where he planned to monitor the recordings and back them up to a secure server in real time. "You don't have to provoke them," Brett said while testing one of the microphones. "Just let them talk. People reveal more when they believe they're in control." "That's exactly what they'll believe," I replied. At exactly 7 in the evening, headlights swept across the front windows of my apartment. A moment later, the sound of car doors echoed through the quiet parking lot outside. I opened the door before anyone could knock. My father stood closest to the entrance, wearing the same composed expression he used during business negotiations. Victor Halston had built his reputation on calm authority, and even after the chaos of the wedding, he still carried himself like a man who expected the world to obey him. My mother stood beside him in a pale silk jacket, her social smile carefully restored, as if the humiliation inside the stadium had simply been a misunderstanding. Isabella lingered slightly behind them, her posture stiff with uncertainty. "Thank you for inviting us," my father said politely as he stepped inside. I gestured toward the table. "Dinner's ready." For the first few minutes, the conversation remained cautious and strangely normal. I served the food while my father commented on the apartment building and asked casual questions about my work. My mother complimented the meal with the same gentle tone she used at charity events. Isabella mentioned honeymoon plans she and her new husband had been discussing earlier that day. Listening to them felt surreal. The wedding speech, the whispers in the stadium, the public humiliation that had spread across the internet only 2 days earlier. None of it seemed to exist inside their version of reality. Eventually, my father placed his fork down and leaned back in his chair. "Alice," he said calmly, "what happened at the wedding created unnecessary attention. Your reaction made the situation worse than it needed to be." My mother nodded in agreement. Families sometimes say things they don't mean when emotions are high. Isabella looked between them and then at me, clearly waiting for the apology they expected. I took a slow breath before speaking. "You're right," I said quietly. "Something important happened that night." My father's expression softened slightly, assuming the conversation was finally moving toward reconciliation. "That's why I asked you here," I continued. I stood from the table and walked toward the small speaker resting on the shelf behind him. When I placed it in the center of the table, the mood in the room changed instantly. My father frowned. "What is that supposed to be?" "The reason I wanted this conversation recorded," I replied. Before anyone could respond, I pressed play on the laptop. For a moment, the only sound was faint static, captured during the beginning of the recording. Then my father's voice filled the room, calm and confident as he spoke to someone about a shipment moving through Eastern Europe. The conversation referenced routing codes and delivery schedules that never appeared in Halston Strategic Transport's official reports. The recording lasted less than 30 seconds, but the meaning was unmistakable. My father's chair scraped sharply against the floor as he leaned forward. "Turn that off," he said sharply. I didn't move. Isabella looked at the speaker and then at my father, confusion spreading across her face. "Dad, what was that?" Instead of answering, my father stared at me with a mixture of anger and calculation. "Where did you get that recording?" he demanded. "That's not the important question," I said calmly. I slid a folder across the table toward Isabella. Inside were copies of shipment manifests, payment logs, and registration records connecting Halston Strategic Transport to several offshore companies. She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the documents as the silence in the room grew heavier. "This is ridiculous," my father said sharply. "Anyone can fabricate recordings and paperwork." "That's true," I replied, "but fabrications usually don't come with 4 years of supporting evidence." My mother's expression changed instantly as she realized the conversation was no longer under her control. Isabella looked up from the documents, her voice quieter now. "Dad," she asked slowly, "what exactly is Alice talking about?" For the first time that evening, my father didn't have an immediate answer, and the dinner had only just begun. For several seconds after the recording ended, no one spoke. The silence in the room pressed against the walls like something heavy that none of us knew how to move. Isabella sat frozen with the folder open in front of her, her eyes scanning the pages again as if she expected the numbers and company names to rearrange themselves into something less disturbing. My father remained leaning forward with his hands flat on the table, his calm authority slowly tightening into something colder. My mother stared at the speaker in the center of the table as if it were an object that had suddenly become dangerous. My father was the first to recover. He leaned back slowly in his chair and adjusted his jacket, restoring the controlled posture that had carried him through decades of boardroom negotiations. "You've misunderstood something," he said evenly. "Logistics companies deal with complicated international shipments. A small fragment of a conversation doesn't mean anything." His voice sounded confident, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the effort behind it. "I expected you to say that," I replied. I reached toward the laptop again and pressed another key. A second recording began playing. This one lasted longer. My father's voice once again filled the room, but this time the conversation contained clearer references to shipment quantities and delivery windows disguised under vague product codes. The person speaking with him mentioned a transfer that would bypass normal customs inspection because it was registered under commercial cargo documentation. When the recording ended, Isabella slowly raised her head. "Dad," she said quietly, "what is this?" My father turned toward me instead of answering her. "Where did you get these files?" he demanded. "That's not the important question," I said calmly. "The important question is why they exist." Before he could interrupt, I reached for another folder beside my plate and slid it across the table toward my mother. Her hand hesitated for a moment before she opened it. Unlike the documents Isabella had been reading, these pages contained financial transfers and property records connected to several private trust accounts registered under my mother's name. Payment summaries showed money moving regularly from those trusts to luxury apartments in Miami and Los Angeles. My mother's face lost its color almost instantly. "These are private financial records," she said sharply. "You had no right to access them." "That's true," I answered quietly. "But your charity foundation probably didn't intend for its donations to pay the rent for 3 different apartments." Isabella's head turned quickly toward our mother. "Mom?" she asked. "It's nothing," my mother said quickly. "Temporary arrangements. Alice is misinterpreting them." But her voice had already lost the polished confidence she usually carried into every social situation. The room fell silent again as Isabella looked from the documents in front of her to the folder my mother was holding. For the first time in her life, the perfect version of the Halston family was beginning to fracture. At that moment, Brett stepped quietly into the room from the hallway where he had been monitoring the recording system. My father's head snapped toward him instantly. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Brett remained calm. "Someone who verified the authenticity of every document on this table," he replied. My father stood up abruptly, his chair sliding backward across the floor. "This is blackmail," he said sharply. "You think you can destroy everything this family built because you feel neglected?" I met his gaze without raising my voice. "You destroyed it yourself," I said. My mother pushed her chair away from the table and walked toward the kitchen counter, gripping the edge of the surface as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Isabella remained seated, staring down at the papers in her hands. "You knew about this?" she asked slowly, looking up at me. "For years," I answered. Her eyes widened. "And you never said anything?" "I tried to understand it first," I said quietly. My father's anger had now shifted into something colder and more calculating. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "If any of this becomes public, it will destroy this family." I folded my hands on the table. "You destroyed this family 2 nights ago," I said calmly, "when you decided to erase me in front of 1,000 people. The silence that followed felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of denial. It was the silence of realization, because for the first time, my father understood that the story he had spent his entire life controlling was no longer his to write. The night after the dinner ended quietly, but the consequences began moving almost immediately. Within 24 hours, the first cracks in the Halston reputation appeared in places my father had always believed were secure. At first, it was only whispers circulating through business circles and private investment groups, questions about certain shipping routes, quiet requests from partners asking for clarification about a few international contracts. None of it was public yet, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. For decades, my father had operated under the assumption that his influence would prevent anyone from looking too closely at the details of his business. Halston Strategic Transport had built a polished image as a reliable logistics company, working with government agencies and major corporations. Investors trusted the name. Politicians attended charity dinners hosted by my mother. Journalists praised the family's generosity, but reputations like that survive only as long as people believe the story. Now the story was starting to fracture. Brett and I spent the following days organizing the evidence that had been quietly gathering on my laptop for years. Every recording was duplicated and stored on secure servers. Every financial document was indexed and cross-referenced with corporate records. We didn't rush the process. The truth had already begun spreading through networks of people who understood how to recognize suspicious financial patterns. 3 days after the dinner, the first official inquiry appeared. A government compliance office sent a formal request to Halston Strategic Transport asking for documentation related to several shipments connected to a subsidiary company in Eastern Europe. The request itself didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but it signaled that investigators had begun reviewing the records. My father's world depended on the assumption that no one would ever ask those questions. Now they were asking them. The reaction inside the Halston social circle was almost immediate. Invitations that once arrived weekly at my mother's office suddenly stopped appearing. Charity donors quietly postponed meetings. 2 board members from her foundation resigned without explanation. No one publicly accused Eleanor Halston of anything, but the tone of every conversation had changed. Reputation is fragile in circles built on prestige. Once doubt appears, distance follows quickly. Isabella experienced the collapse in a different way. Her wedding had been designed as the ultimate celebration of the Halston family image. The ceremony inside the stadium had been broadcast across social media platforms and featured in several lifestyle magazines. For a few hours, she had been exactly what my parents always wanted her to be, the perfect daughter representing a perfect family. But less than a week later, that image began unraveling. Her husband's business partners started asking cautious questions about the rumors surrounding Halston Strategic Transport. Financial journalists began publishing small investigative reports discussing irregular transport contracts connected to companies linked to my father. None of the articles mentioned criminal activity directly, but the tone had shifted from admiration to suspicion. Isabella could no longer ignore the change. Brett heard about the confrontation that followed through one of his professional contacts. According to the story, Isabella had confronted our parents late one evening after reading one of the reports online. She demanded an explanation for the documents she had seen during the dinner. For the first time in her life, she wasn't defending the Halston reputation. She was questioning it. That realization must have shaken her more than anything I said at the table. 5 days after the wedding, the situation escalated again. A journalist from a financial investigation group published a detailed article analyzing several suspicious shipping routes connected to Halston Strategic Transport. The article did not include my name or the recordings I possessed, but the pattern described in the report matched the evidence Brett and I had already studied for years. Anyone reading the article could see that something larger was unfolding. By that point, my father's position inside the business community had begun deteriorating rapidly. 2 major partners suspended cooperation with his company until the investigation clarified the situation. Investors requested internal audits. Lawyers began preparing official statements in case authorities expanded their inquiry into a full criminal investigation. For a man who had spent his entire career projecting control and certainty, the sudden loss of confidence around his company must have felt like the ground disappearing beneath him. My mother's world was collapsing just as quickly. The charity boards that once celebrated her leadership now avoided public association with the Halston name. Friends who had spent years attending her galas suddenly stopped returning calls. Social status depends heavily on perception, and once suspicion enters the room, loyalty rarely survives long. On the 7th evening after the wedding, the consequences finally reached my front door. I had just finished reviewing another set of documents with Brett when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, all 3 members of my family were standing on the small porch outside my apartment. My father looked older than he had only a week earlier. The confident posture he carried inside the stadium had been replaced by the stiff tension of someone who had spent days fighting problems that refused to disappear. My mother stood behind him with red eyes and trembling hands. Isabella remained slightly apart from them, her face pale and exhausted. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father cleared his throat. "We need to talk," he said quietly. For the first time in my life, the Halston family was standing at my door without power, without certainty, and without the story they had always used to protect themselves. And they had finally come to the only place where the truth still lived. When my father, my mother, and my sister stepped into my apartment that night, the silence between us felt heavier than anything that had happened during the past week. The same dining table where the truth had first surfaced still stood in the center of the room, untouched since the night of the dinner. My father looked at it briefly before sitting down in the chair he had occupied before. The authority he had carried into my life for 28 years was gone now. What remained was the cautious posture of a man who finally understood that control had slipped beyond his reach. My mother remained near the window, staring out at the parking lot lights as if she hoped to avoid the conversation waiting inside the room. Isabella stood beside the table for a moment before slowly sitting down across from me. The exhaustion in her face made her look older than she had only days earlier. For most of her life, she had believed the Halston family represented discipline, respect, and success. The past week had forced her to question everything she thought she knew. My father spoke first. "You've made your point," he said quietly. His voice sounded lower than I had ever heard it. "The situation has gone far enough." I watched him carefully without answering. The same man who had once controlled boardrooms and government contracts now sounded like someone trying to negotiate the end of a crisis he could no longer manage. My mother finally turned away from the window. "Everything is collapsing," she said. "Your father's company is under investigation. The foundation has lost its donors. People we've known for decades won't even answer our calls." Her voice trembled slightly, but what struck me most was what she didn't say. She didn't mention the stadium. She didn't mention the humiliation that had spread across the internet after the wedding. She didn't mention the moment when thousands of people watched her laugh while my father erased me from the family. Even now, she was still protecting the story that had mattered more than anything else. Isabella leaned forward slowly. "Alice," she said, "we didn't come here to fight again." Her voice carried something new I had never heard before. Uncertainty. "We came because we need to fix this." My father nodded in agreement. "You can stop this," he said. "You can tell investigators the documents were misunderstood. You can say the recordings were taken out of context. Once the attention fades, we can handle everything privately." For a moment, the room fell completely quiet. I realized then that my father still believed this was a negotiation. He believed the truth I had revealed was just another problem that could be managed with influence and careful statements. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at him. "You're not here because you understand what you did," I said calmly. "You're here because the consequences finally reached you." My mother lowered her eyes. Isabella didn't move. "For 28 years," I continued, "this family decided who mattered and who didn't. You built an entire reputation on the idea that our lives were perfect. And when I didn't fit the image you wanted the world to see, you treated me like something that needed to disappear." My father remained silent, but the tension in his shoulders said everything. "The night of the wedding, you made one thing clear," I said. "You told the world I was a mistake." The words settled heavily in the room. I let the silence last for several seconds before speaking again. "I was never the mistake." I looked from my father to my mother, and finally to Isabella. "I was the truth you never wanted anyone to see." No one argued after that. My father slowly stood from the chair and walked toward the door without another word. My mother followed him a few seconds later, her composure finally gone now that the reputation she had spent decades protecting was collapsing around her. Isabella remained sitting for a moment longer before she looked up at me. "I didn't know," she said quietly. I believed her, but knowing the truth too late doesn't erase the damage done by believing the lie. She stood and walked toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving the apartment. When the door closed behind them, the room fell completely silent again. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or dismissed. It was the silence of finally standing on my own terms. The Halston name would continue facing investigations, financial scrutiny, and the slow unraveling of the reputation my parents had built for decades. That story would unfold in courtrooms, news reports, and quiet conversations in places where influence once protected them. But that part of the story no longer belonged to me. I walked toward the window and looked out at the quiet city streets below. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. And if you've listened to this entire story, I want to ask you something. At what moment would you have drawn the line? Would it have been the humiliation in front of 1,000 people, or would you have walked away from a family like this long before that night? If this story made you think about boundaries, truth, or the courage it takes to stand up for yourself, share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about justice, hidden truths, and people who finally choose dignity over silence, consider subscribing and staying with this channel. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone's life. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them define yours ever again. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.